Hello, English Literature 2. This is our second week of instruction. Today we'll be taking up the Victorian world and particularly the work of Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol. I'm using this lovely version, illustrated with lots of notes. I'm also putting up a lot of Christmas Carol notes. I've got a huge lecture up there for you that you should take a look at, and it'll be posted right after I post this video. The text of A Christmas Carol was a beloved text of Victorian culture, but also today. Everybody makes movie versions of this story, and I think almost everybody knows this story, knows even a little bit about English literature. A Christmas Carol was Charles Dickens' favorite story to read out loud. He was a bit of an amateur actor, and he loved to ham it up and read A Christmas Carol, and he would make people cry with his readings of this famous story. The story is a ghost story, and it starts off in a very scary way. It says, A Christmas Carol, Stave 1. Well, A Christmas Carol is a song like called Rest You Merry Gentlemen, Let Nothing You Dismay. That's A Christmas Carol. And so music has a staff. And if you've got many of them, you've got stave 1, staves, right? Staves. And so these are musical staffs instead of chapters. And so as you look at it, stave 1, A Christmas Carol. Marley's ghost. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was dead as a doornail. I read you that opening 2 paragraphs to show you that the tone is switching. One minute it's a scary ghost story, and the next minute it sounds like a garrulous, talkative, gossipy friend talking over a cup of coffee or tea with you. Like, oh, did you hear what happened to so-and-so down the street in that strange part of town? That's how Dickens became famous. He had this style called the Dickensian style. The Dickensian style is this humorous, gossipy style, which almost sounds like you're talking to a friend over a table. And because he sounded like that in his books, he became unbelievably popular. And even in families where people were illiterate, they'd usually have one child who was sent to school, and he would have the responsibility of reading out a Dickens story to the family. And Dickens serialized his stories the way we watch Breaking Bad. And so that's why it's wrong to torture 8th grade students with giant thick novels like Great Expectations, because then you're binging a whole season of Dickens. What Dickens did was he published 4 chapters at a time, and people read them, and they had the child in their house who could read it, and everybody said, oh, what's going to happen next? Oh, we have to wait 2 months to get the next one. You know, that's how a Dickens novel was actually written, serialized and for the popular taste. Everything about him was about communicating to the popular taste, and he became outrageously popular, and he became the greatest novelist of all time, the biggest novel. He influenced Dostoevsky, he influenced Tolstoy, he influenced everybody else to write these kind of novels. So Charles Dickens changed the world by his style. So the style is going from the serious ghost story about a man named Marley who's dead to a comedy voice of gossip and fear and speculation. Those two views have to go with you all the way through the story as well. He then goes on to describe Scrooge. And he says that Scrooge was, oh, but he was a tight-fisted, hand at the grindstone Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. All right, so the description of Scrooge is the miser description, right? The skinflint, the guy who's scraping every penny, and even though he's very rich, he hoards everything. He's a hoarder, and he actually has hoarding consciousness. He holds on to everything. But when people hoard, that's usually a sign that they lost something. They have had some abandonment issue or something like that. So they hold on to material things because they can't have the thing that they want. His name, Scrooge, is one of these Dickensian names. Ebenezer in the Bible means old. And Scrooge means to screw you over, to put the screws to you. and also to scrounge, for every penny, to scrounge. And he puts the two words, Scrooge, Scrooge, and that becomes one word, Scrooge. His clerk, or clerk as we say in America, his clerk, Bob Cratchit, scratches away dipping ink in and scratching out accounts all day long with his pen and ink or pencil, and all day long he's writing and scratching away at paper. So his name is Bob Scratchit. In England, in America, it would be Buck Scratchit. He's scratching every day for a buck. In England, a bob is like a buck. And so you'd say, oh, he's scratching away for a bob. Scratching away for a bob. Bob Scratchit or Bob Cratchit. All the names, Tiny Tim. All of the names, Belle, which means beautiful. That's Scrooge's one lady love. Look at these names through the story. Old Fezziwig. He must wear one of the old wigs that you see judges wearing, because he lived in those olden days, 30 or 40 years ago, when people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson wore powdered wigs. Old Fezziwig, Fuzzywig is what his name really means. So look for these names as you go through it. Topper is a guy who must wear a top hat, that sort of thing. Then as you go through, please notice that we start off in the shop with Scrooge, and his nephew comes in. And the nephew says hello, and he brings warmth into the house. He says, the story starts on this page. It says, once upon a time, of all the good times in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. Well, once upon a time, we know, is the opening of a fairy tale. And this is a fairy tale, or it's a tale of fairy. And in this foggy night where you can barely see the buildings on the other side of the street because the fog is so thick, in comes Fred, the nephew of Scrooge. A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you, cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew. Bah, said Scrooge. Humbug! He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow, and his face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. Christmas? Humbug, Uncle, said Scrooge's nephew. You don't mean that, I am sure. I do, said Scrooge. Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough. Come then, returned the nephew gaily. What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough. Scrooge, having no better answer, ready on the spur of the moment, said, bah! Again, and followed it up with, humbug! Don't be cross, Uncle. What else can I be, returned the uncle, when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. A time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you. If I could work my will, said Scrooge indignantly, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should. Uncle, pleaded the nephew. Nephew, returned the uncle, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine. Keep it, repeated Scrooge's nephew, but you don't keep it. Let me leave it alone, then, said Scrooge. Much good may it do you, much good it has ever done you. And then, after this very funny exchange where Scrooge wants to drive stakes through the hearts of everybody who goes around saying Merry Christmas, and he's so miserable, Fred says this: there are many things for which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited. I dare say, returned the nephew, Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they were really fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. Let me hear another sound, from you, said Scrooge, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. So Bob Cratchit, in the distant cell a few feet away, hears this wonderful speech about Christmas, and he applauds. And Scrooge's response on Christmas Eve is to say, I'll fire you if you do that again. Oh, you're out of a job. Guy threatens to fire somebody on Christmas Eve. This is Scrooge. It's very funny. He's a real wonderful type of character. But I want to draw your attention to Fred's speech, which, if you forgive my hammy acting, he says at the end of the speech, I believe Christmas has done me good and will do me good, and I say God bless it. That Trinity, do you see it? Has, will, bless it now. That's past, future, present. Those are the three ghosts. The fog and Marley having died 7 years ago this night, that's part of it as well. Everything about this play, everything about this story is evoking what will come in the dream this night. After Fred goes out, after he invites Scrooge to dinner, Christmas dinner, and leaves, two charitable gentlemen come in, and they try to get Scrooge to give them a donation for the poor and the hungry. Scrooge says his famous lines, are there no prisons? And the charitable gentleman says, plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? They are still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour, then, said Scrooge. Both very, very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it. And then one of the charitable gentlemen says, under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christmas Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of wealth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, said Scrooge. You wish to be anonymous. I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. And Scrooge says, if they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. The charitable gentleman says, but you might know it, sir. Wow. That scene's amazing, because the charitable gentleman first come in and say, are you Mr. Marley or Mr. Scrooge? And Scrooge was too cheap to ever scratch out Marley's name from the sign. So he answers to both names. But tonight he tells him, he goes, Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. And he says, these 7 years, in fact, he died 7 years ago, this very night. Wow. So when the charitable gentlemen come in, they evoke Marley's ghost, who will appear that night. And Scrooge remembers it was on Christmas Eve that he died. And then they ask him for this contribution. He says, you know, there's want everywhere. And Scrooge says, I don't know that. And he says, you might know it. Well, that's ignorance and want. Scrooge is showing his ignorance to want. And want is an evil, but ignorance is an even greater evil, says Dickens. That is a very important idea in this story. Lastly, those things that he mentioned, the poor law, the treadmill, the union workhouses were torturous. Poor houses for people got in debt. If you maxed out your credit cards or went over limit and you defaulted, they'd put you in prison in those days, folks. So just imagine all the people would be in prison today, in debtors' prisons. Or the union workhouses were often for women who couldn't find people to take care of them because they didn't marry. A lot of these places were terrible places where people worked in horrible industrial factory conditions with no labor safety laws. The treadmill was a punishment for people in debtors' prison, where they'd walk 8 hours a day on a treadmill with 15-minute breaks, just grinding grain or pumping water or something. And they just do this 8 hours a day on these treadmills. You'd see 10 of them in a row doing this. It's horrible. You know, you go to the health club and work out for 30 minutes and you think that's a workout. These guys were on these things as punishment for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day. So Scrooge is pointing to the very worst elements of aspects of of Victorian society. And a lot of those aspects were brought about, including the poor law, by the writings of a Christian minister named Thomas Malthus, who did the math and said, well, if the poor keep breeding, then they're going to only produce more poor, and then we won't have enough food. They'll increase geometrically. So the right thing to do is not feed the poor and not help them and make them responsible people. So that's where this whole theory of workhouses and debtors' prisons came from. It came from a minister. Minister said that Jesus wanted us not to feed the poor. I don't think that's an accurate reading of the Bible. So think about this. In Scrooge's mind, he thinks he's a very good person, that he's doing things the right way. He thinks he's following the Christian values of Malthus. He thinks he's earned his own money and he shouldn't spread it around. I want you to finish the story and read through what happens next and be aware that the child is father of the man. Have a good one. Bye-bye.